Welcome back, everyone, to Furthering Christendom. I am your co-host, Mike DeVito, here as always with the good doctor, Dr. Tyler McNabb. And we have an incredibly special guest today, a man who needs no introduction, but I'll do it anyway. But that is Dr. Joshua Rasmussen. So Dr. Rasmussen is a professor of philosophy at Azusa Pacific University. And again, Dr. Rasmussen is no stranger to the people that watch this show. But obviously published a lot in analytic metaphysics, philosophy of religion, all kinds of different topics. And so we are incredibly grateful. Dr. Rasmussen, how are you doing today? Thank you so much.
I'm doing great. Yeah, thanks, Mike. Thanks for having me on. This is wonderful. Appreciate it.
It's great. And there's so many different ways we can go. And I don't want to take up too much of your time, but I know one thing that you've worked on a lot and obviously have some expertise in is the argument from contingency. And I think that'd be something that our listeners would be interested to hear you talk about. So maybe you could, if you don't mind, lay out sort of what is the argument from contingency.
Yeah, okay. So I thought I would unpack it, and I always like to use objects to help illustrate things. So you can think of the argument from contingency as a basic strategy for trying to account for, this here represents contingent things. Okay, and contingent things are things that exist, but their inclusion within reality, their existence, is not a matter of necessity, because instead they could fail to exist. You might imagine a possible world where this yellow bit of reality is gone, right? And so because contingent things could fail to exist, this inspires the question, well, why do they exist? Why are they in existence rather than not? And the argument from contingency seeks to give an ultimate explanation. So let's say this represents all the contingent things. An ultimate explanation of the contingent things won't be in terms of those same contingent things. That would be circular. So if there is an ultimate explanation of contingent things, there's got to be something else that is not self-contingent, but that provides a kind of ultimate foundation for the contingent things. And I think that's kind of a picturesque way of illustrating the general strategy of the argument from contingency, seeking to explain contingent things in terms of something that's not itself contingent, but has necessary existence. And then there are various ways of unpacking that general different versions of the argument. But I feel like this general picture kind of helps convey the basic idea, so that instead of going into all the different versions, you can sort of see it's basically explaining contingent things in terms of a necessary non-contingent thing.
Hey, Josh, great to have you on. Really appreciate you coming on, and good to talk with you for the first time. By the way, also I like your book cover there behind you. I think that's pretty neat that you did that.
Yeah, the publisher sent that in the mail, and I thought, okay,
nice.
Well, that's really cool.
Yeah, absolutely.
Really cool.
So, what if someone says, "All right, when we say universe, it's like a useful fiction. It's a useful fiction. There is no universe, so to speak, as if the universe is this thing that needs explanation, right? Instead, there are just contingent things, and these contingent things all have explanations, and other contingent things ad infinitum, right? How would you respond to this? I know in your work you give a turtle example, which I really like. I thought maybe you could go through that a little bit, and however else you want to handle this objection and respond to it, that would be helpful.
Yeah, I'll give the turtle example, but first let me just kind of draw out a little bit the concern. There's maybe two concerns packed into one. So just think again about this object, and there might be a question about like how this came into being. Okay, and this isn't a metaphor anymore. I'm just talking about this actual yellow, whatever this is that we're seeing. You might wonder how this came into being. And you might think that, well, there's got to be some explanation, and it's not just in terms of itself. There's something maybe that manufactured it. Okay, now, but somebody could reply, they could say, well, maybe there's no such thing as this yellow conglomeration. There's just yellow parts. So there's this thing that's yellow, and there's this thing that's yellow. There's all these different parts, but there's not, in addition to these parts, the thing itself. And so the argument that this thing has to have a transcendent explanation assumes a premise that's dubious, namely that there is such a thing. There's just the parts, right? And in response to that, and I'll get to the infinite regress and the turtles in a moment, but in response to just this concern that there's no such thing as those parts together, or the universe or whatever, I think what is helpful is just to clarify that we can formulate the argument from contingency in terms of the plural of the things. So what I mean is we can ask, what explains these things? Even if there's no thing in addition to the things, what explains the many? And the thought here is that merely having many yellow things stacked up in any arbitrary shape or configuration is not going to give us an explanation of why there are those yellow things at all. And again, we don't have to assume that there's a thing over and above the things, but we still want to explain the plural of all the things. Now, what about the infinite regress? Maybe we say, well, as long as there's infinitely many yellow things all the way down, or infinitely many turtles all the way down, then all of a sudden we don't need a further explanation. And I think the turtle example kind of helps to illustrate that actually, when you just think about it intuitively, if there were an infinite stack of turtles somewhere, maybe you go outside and you see a turtle and you're like, how did that get there? And you see it's holding on desperately to a turtle above it. Well, how did that one get there? Oh, it's holding on to one above that, all the way up to infinity. You still might be wondering, okay, well, what explains the entire chain? And even if you don't think of the chain as a thing, you just think of it as a plural of things, plural of turtles, there's still this deeper question: what explains why there are those turtles? Why not an infinite series of snakes or an infinite series of yellow blocks, right? And so I think if you really want a deeper explanation, then you're not going to appeal to the things, no matter how many there are, whether infinite or finite. So that would be basically my answer to those two different objections. The first objection, that there's no such thing as the universe, and the second, that maybe there's an infinite chain. And in both cases, I don't think we answer that deeper question. Well, what explains the elements of the chain? What explains that? Why are there those elements? And why is there anything even like that, right? Why are there any contingent things at all? William Rowe talks about this. Why not instead just nothing? Why these contingent things, and why any contingent things? You're not going to explain that in terms of contingent things, because that would be circular, it seems to me.
Right. That's great. What about sort of a response? How do you think, put on your naturalist hat? How would you go to work against the theist if the theist gave this sort of response? And then how would you respond to your naturalist self?
Yeah. Okay. Now, this is interesting because at this level in the conversation, it's pretty rare to actually reach this place in the dialectic back and forth. But I have had actually quite a few conversations that have reached this place. And I was thinking about this earlier. I was thinking, okay, what is the best of those responses that I've encountered? And I'll tell you, it seems like it's the general strategy is to say, okay, maybe there's some infinite change, like infinite turtles or infinite blue balls or an infinite number of yellow puzzles, that wouldn't really explain why there are those things. And it wouldn't remove the need for an explanation. But maybe there are other infinite series that would be different. And so this is maybe kind of a strategy in these conversations. Like, maybe you can show that some infinite series would still have a further explanation, but maybe others would be exempt from a further explanation. When I was in graduate school, Wes Morriston proposed an idea like this to me. And I've seen this come up a few other times. The idea is that, here's a set of assumptions. Maybe the universe is infinitely old, and maybe the only way to explain the universe, to explain anything, is in terms of something that comes before in time, the thing that's to be explained. And if we accept those two premises, then the only way to explain the infinitely old universe is if there's something that comes before the infinitely old universe, which you might think is impossible. So I remember Wes was saying, maybe this is a model of reality on which you wouldn't have an explanation for the universe. And this might be really the best kind of response at this place to that. Any questions about that response? You probably want me to respond to the response at this point.
Yeah, now take off your naturalist hat for our viewers and put on your theist hat.
Yeah, okay. At this point, let me just clarify. Naturalism and theism isn't quite even at stake yet, right? Because you can think of the argument from contingency. I didn't say this at first, but you can think of it as coming into two stages. So the first stage identifies a kind of foundational layer that has necessary existence. And then in the second stage identifies the nature of that foundation as perhaps having a supreme nature.
Right.
So I think even a naturalist could, in principle, take on board the idea that there's a kind of foundational thing that is required to explain the contingent things, no matter how many there are, whether they're infinite or finite.
For sure.
And so now going back to this idea that, well, what if the only way to explain contingent things is in terms of something prior? And then we think, well, and maybe contingent things go back to infinity, and therefore there can't be an explanation. So I've actually thought that this is sort of an interesting move, because if you have independent reasons to think that A, the explanation has to be prior in time, and B, contingent things go back to infinity, okay, then you're going to now have a reason to think there can't be some deeper explanation of the contingent things. That actually makes sense. But unless you have those independent motivations for those premises, it's not enough, I think, at this point to just say, well, for all we know, contingent things might go infinitely back in time. And for all we know, the explanation has to come before the cause. Because you might actually work in the reverse. You might think, okay, wait, it seems intuitive that contingency itself calls for an explanation, that there can't just be a contingent group without an explanation. So then, if it's true, let's just take one of those assumptions. Let's say you're convinced that explanations have to come before in time from the thing to be explained. Well, then it's just going to follow that the contingent series can't go back infinitely, because you already have a reason to think that there is an explanation, and you already have an independent reason to think that the explanation would have to be prior, which is going to remove the infinite regress option. Or you might go the other way. You might say, well, I have independent reason to think that there's infinite regress, but then that's going to cut against thinking that the explanation has to go prior. So, I mean, there's a lot here, but I think sort of in summary, the basic response that I would have is that merely coming up with scenarios in which contingent things couldn't have an explanation doesn't thereby remove the reasons to think that contingent things would have an explanation. In fact, if anything, the reasons to think that contingent things would have an explanation is just evidence against those scenarios. If there are scenarios in which contingent things have no explanation, but you have reason to think that they would, that's a good reason to doubt the scenarios in which they wouldn't have an explanation.
All right, great. Thanks very much for that. I'll go ahead now and pass the ball to Mike, and he can pose us.
Yeah, no, that was really good, Josh. Thank you. If this question differs from the last one, then go ahead and answer it. But if not, maybe there's another objection. But I did want to ask you, what objection to the because you said you've engaged with this argument a ton, and you've dealt with opponents, and you've dealt with, I'm sure, a ton of objections. Which objection to the contingency argument have you found to be the most troubling, and how would you respond to that? And if it's the response you just dealt with,
it's a different one. Yeah, no, that's a great question. I wouldn't say that I'm particularly troubled by any objections. I sort of think of the objections as help clarifying what's at stake. In fact, I think some objections successfully undermine certain versions of the argument from contingency. So I think that this is one of the reasons that there are so many different objections, is because philosophers have been kind of working on tightening the argument and finding its best form. But I would say that the objection that I've thought the most about is one that has to do with the connection between the necessary foundation of things and then the contingent effects, the connection between them. So just to kind of illustrate this, imagine that there's a necessary being we'll call God that produces a contingent universe. Okay. Now we can ask about the production. Is the producing of the universe contingent or necessary? If you say the production of the universe is necessary, well, then since the cause is necessary and it's necessary that it produce its effect, then the effect has to be necessary, which contradicts the idea that some effects are actually contingent. If you say instead that the connection between the cause and the effect is contingent, it's only contingent, it's not necessary, well, then it's part of the very contingent reality that's to be explained. And so you might think there's a kind of circularity there, either that or kind of infinite regress, where you have the contingent connection to the contingent connection, and then the contingent connection to the contingent connection to the contingent connection, if you say that the cause causes all the contingent reality. All right, I always call this the most advanced objection. It's pretty sophisticated. It's been developed in contemporary analytic articles by some people will recognize this in Peter Van Inwagen. I first found it in William Rowe. Ross has an example of this kind of objection. And this is the one I think that's really caused me the most pause about, okay, what's at stake here? My basic response is to clarify. I have several different responses, but one kind of simple response is just to clarify that when we're looking for the explanation of contingent things, we can narrow the scope of the principle to the contingent things that I would say most clearly would call for further explanation, namely let's call them substances, or the things that have the properties, the things that perform the actions. And then this will leave open. So let me just illustrate this a bit more. So let's say that these contingent things, they don't just come from nothing. There's something that caused them, but maybe the cause could act contingently, where the contingent action is explained in terms of motivations or reasons or the nature of the cause itself. But that explanation doesn't have to be deterministic. It can be non-deterministic. So that it's only the contingent things that come into being or that are just contingent that have a cause in terms of a necessary thing that indeterministically produces those contingent things. And that indeterministic production is not itself unexplained. It's explained in terms of its basic reasons, which are non-deterministic explanations. So there's a lot there, but I think that objection just really helps to clarify which form of the argument from contingency stands the brightest among the different forms, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that was great. And I guess one quick follow-up, and you don't have to get into it too deep, but I was just wondering, does your model of God play into how you think about these things, right? So whether you're a classical theist or a neoclassical theist, does that have any sort of bearing on how you think about this argument? And does this argument fit better within one sort of model of God compared to another one?
Yeah, sure. I mean, it certainly can. I mean, in fact, it might go in different directions. So it could be that your model of God will affect how you think of the argument, but then you're thinking about the argument can also affect your model of God.
Yeah.
I mean, for example, you might think that, well, if there's this causal structure of reality where there's contingent things that bottom out in a necessary thing, then there has to be some kind of indeterministic link in there somewhere. And this might be a reason to think that the way that God made the world is through a free choice, not through a deterministic action, but rather through a free and indeterministic action.
Oh, that's really interesting. Josh, thank you. But before we let you go, can you kind of catch us up on projects that you're working on, things we can expect coming out in the future? I know all of us listening to this really enjoy your work and are grateful for your work. So what's coming up next?
I appreciate that. Thank you, Mike. Yeah, so I'm so excited about this project. I've been working on this book on consciousness and the nature of persons. And this book seeks to answer two questions. What is the nature of persons, conscious persons, or conscious beings more generally? And then what is the ultimate origin? How can we explain our existence? So this has been my project that I've been eating and breathing, and I'm very excited about that. That's I got the first draft back to the publisher. I'm hoping that will come out maybe in the summertime. I don't want to rush it. I really want to make sure we put together something very good. But yeah, that's the main thing I've been working on at this time.
Awesome, Josh. Well, we're going to have you back on to talk about that if you have time. But thank you so much for making time today and for all the insight. We're incredibly grateful. And again, hopefully we have you on soon to talk about the new stuff. So thank you so much, Josh. We appreciate it.
Thank you. It sounds wonderful. Thanks, Tyler.